Good evening and welcome to our Bible study here at Malpas. And once again, a warm welcome to those who are joining us online. We hope you were blessed by listening to this study tonight. We are still in Matthew's Gospel. We are still in chapter 18, and we will be picking it up tonight at verse 7. That's Matthew chapter 18 and verse 7. And if you remember last week, we were talking about having a large millstone hung round your neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. Okay, so I'm going to read verses 7 to 9. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to sin. Such things must come, but woe to the man through whom they come. If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life maimed or crippled than to have 2 hands and 2 feet and be thrown into eternal fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to enter into life with 1 eye than to have 2 eyes and be thrown into the fire of hell. Yeah, that's not the kind of verse you want to read when you're like 10 or 11, is it? You know. It used to horrify me, the thought of people chopping their hands off and gouging an eye out. No. Okay, so there are 2 woes in verse 7. Woe to the world because of offences, and woe to that man by whom the offence comes. Now, if you look up woe in Collins' dictionary, it's described as very great suffering, and it's synonymous with misery, suffering, trouble, and pain. The first woe is a cry of pity for a world in danger of offences. Very great suffering, misery, pain, and trouble will come to the world because of offences or sin. And the second woe is a warning to the one who brings or introduces evil to others. Very great suffering, misery, pain, and trouble will come to those who bring the offence or sin. Now, we live in a fallen world, and it's inevitable that sin and hurt and offences are going to come. Yet the person who brings the offence or the sin is guilty before God and has got no excuse. The question is often asked, and I'm sure you've heard it asked, why does God allow sin and suffering? The website Contending for the Faith says this: God looks at those who deliberately set out to trap his children like a natural father looks at the bully who constantly abuses his child. Both fathers feel the pain and hurt of their children when they fall. So why then does God allow such scandal to go on? The answer is found in God's providential love and timing. In the parable of the wheat and the tares, the owner of the field tells his reapers to let both grow together until harvest. At the harvest, the tares will be bound and burned. The same is true here. While Christians would like their Father to rid them of all temptations and snares, this is not his will. By allowing good and evil to coexist, God provides more opportunity for his children to prove their faithfulness to him. Were there no evil to avoid, there would also be no choice of whether or not to serve God. There is coming a day, however, when God's judgment will be poured out on all who cause offense. Jesus pronounces the severest of woes on such an offender. The thing is, as Jesus says next, hang on. Bear with me a minute, this thing's just shut itself down. Computers are good until they go wrong. It's, I read somewhere the other day that on the question of why does God allow bad things to happen, or why does God allow people to go to hell, or why does God send people to hell, I think the question was phrased. And the answer was that God doesn't send people to hell. He sent his Son into the world to stop people sending themselves to hell. The trouble is we have to get people out there to to understand it. You know, that's the one thing about using computers. When you've got to scroll back through like 90 pages or 100 and something pages, it takes ages. It's a wonder Microsoft in their wisdom haven't put a button on there, go to where you were last working. Well, I'm up to chapter 17, so we're nearly there. I must learn to keep my hands in my pockets and away from the buttons on this. Yeah. As Jesus says next, such things must come. We live in a fallen world. It's inevitable that we're going to be confronted by sin on a daily basis. Nothing we can do about it. We can't stop it. And it's not possible to avoid it. But it is possible to resist it. And Jesus is saying, woe to those who put a stumbling block in the way of those who are trying to resist sin. Matthew Henry, considering the cunning and malice of Satan and the weakness and depravity of men's hearts, it is not possible but that there should be offenses. God permits them for wise and holy ends, that those who are sincere and those who are not may be made known. Christ came into the world to save souls, and he will reckon severely with those who hinder the progress of others who are setting their faces heavenwards. Should be a warning to people, but the arrogance that stands in a lot of people will prevent them from seeing this message. More's the pity. Now, verses 8 and 9 should already be familiar to us, because this is not the first time he said such a thing. If you think back to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 29 in the Sermon on the Mount, and we read, if your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go to hell. Now, I'm pleased to say that, as before, these words of Jesus are just a metaphor. They're not meant to be taken literally, because I'm sure, I don't know about you, but speaking of myself in my early life, I'd have very quickly ended up with no arms and no eyes. Yeah, I was a squaddy, don't forget. You don't want to know what I got up to in my young days. What Jesus is basically saying is that just as pulling your eye out or cutting your hand off is a really drastic thing to do, so we need to take drastic measures to avoid falling into sin. We need to be prepared to give up our most prized possessions if it causes us to sin, or to walk away from our most cherished relationships if that person causes us to sin. And I'll give you an example, because I've fallen into this trap myself in the past. Supposing you own a car. I'll pick on my son's car because it's a nice one, a top-of-the-range Range Rover. Supposing you've got that parked outside your house. It's the type of car that most petrol heads would probably die to own. Suppose every time you look out the window at your car, you think, what a beautiful car that is, and that is all mine. You're in danger of the sin of pride. You're in danger of making your car an object of worship, a god. And it's better for you to get rid of that car, even if it's your pride and joy, than to be thrown into the eternal fires of hell because of pride. Or supposing you've got a friend, supposing you've known them since childhood. You might be in your 50s, you might have gone to school together when you were 4 and 5. Suppose they're always encouraging you to steal from work. Oh, it's only a pen, it won't hurt. Or suppose they're trying to get you to watch things on telly that you really know you shouldn't be watching. Oh, it's only a film, it won't hurt. Perhaps you need to think about walking away from that relationship, even though it's a cherished one. Because it's better to walk away from a friendship than allow yourself to be thrown into hell because of sin. Nobody ever said that being a Christian was easy. And if it is, you're doing it wrong. Ellicott notes that this teaching was also part of the Sermon on the Mount, emphasizing its importance. The repetition to the disciples underscores the need for personal sacrifice to avoid leading yourself or others into sin. Bridgeway Bible Commentary says this: if people want to be disciples of Jesus, they should not despise those who appear weak and insignificant. Indeed, they should take severe action against themselves to remove from their lives anything that might cause them to follow their own desires instead of submitting to Jesus. Wrong desires prevent people from receiving Jesus and lead only to hell. Remember, sin is sin. It doesn't matter how big or small it is, sin, and sin will separate you from God, and ultimately will result in you spending eternity separated from God. That's the message that Jesus is trying to get across to people here. Not go and cut your hand off, although they still do it in Arab countries. And I tell you what, there'd probably be a lot less theft in this country if they did it over here as well. But, yeah. He's not saying that we should gouge an eye out. He's just trying to make the point that sometimes we have to walk away from what's precious to us. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made to avoid us falling into sin. Have a look at verse 10. Just going to read verse 10. Absolutely. Absolutely. Indeed. Indeed. It's a very hard decision. It's a real struggle sometimes for some people. So, and yes. Yes. Yeah, and that's why you need to be part of a fellowship. Because there are occasions where the struggle is so real that sometimes you need to pick up the phone and say, Joe, I'm struggling with this, mate, I need help. And get your brothers and sisters around you to help you. Okay, verse 10. See that you do not look down on one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven. Now, the fact that Matthew uses the words, one of these little ones, tells us that the child he originally drew the disciples' attention to was probably still with Jesus. If you remember, last week we talked about the child and Jesus and how it was possibly one of Matthew's children. It's likely that this child was still with Jesus. And Matthew has Jesus saying not to look down on one of these little ones. And don't forget, back in those days, although children were loved and cherished, they had no social standing at all, and very often were looked down upon, especially if they're not your children. Other translations use the word despise instead of look down. And this is probably a more accurate translation. The Greek word, here we go again, is kataphronio, I think, which means to look down upon or to treat with scorn, contempt, or disrespect. That's what the original Greek is trying to convey. Commentator Robinson notes, it literally means to think down upon, with an assumption of superiority. So Jesus is perhaps saying, do not think yourself superior to one of these little ones. It is not completely clear if Jesus is speaking in this passage of children or of people of low position, let's say. Those who are greatest in the kingdom of heaven, by the way. Absolutely. Either interpretation would teach a similar lesson. And neither would detract from the other, as the whole passage seems to be about people becoming like little children. From the context, it probably seems likely that it's referring to the second option. But we're told not to look down on people. And again, that is a human characteristic that a lot of people have got, you know. Would be referring to new Christians. Absolutely, yes. It's very easy when you get advanced in your walk with God to think of yourself as superior over new Christians. And we shouldn't really, but it's human nature. It's something else that we've got to fight against. And Jesus is saying here, don't look down on one of these little ones. You could say the word little ones in this context primarily refers to God's spiritual children. In other words, Jesus is warning his disciples about looking down on fellow believers. Fowler is probably correct in suggesting that Jesus means the weak disciples and the slow learners. So if you're in a position where things are going well, it's easy to look down on new Christians who are weaker than you are and criticize them for not being strong and resisting in that. Everybody stumbles towards perfection. Everybody stumbles in their walk, and we shouldn't look down on anybody. That's what the message is trying to say. Now then, the second part of verse 10 is another area that's caused much argument and controversy over the years. It's been widely used to assert the belief in personal guardian angels, but that, scholars believe, is not what is meant here. Certainly the Bible is full of incidents where angels have interacted with people to pass messages on and to provide protection. If you look at Acts 12, verse 7, suddenly an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said, and the chains fell off Peter's wrists. 2 Kings 6:17, and Elisha prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." And then the Lord opened the servant's eyes and looked around and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Acts 8:26. Now an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Rise and go towards the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a desert place." So there's plenty of occasions where we read of angels interacting with people. But nowhere in the Bible are we ever told that believers have a personal guardian angels. Except perhaps Hebrews 1:14 and Psalm 34:7, which possibly could seem to indicate otherwise. Psalm 34 verse 7, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and he delivers them. Hebrews 1:14, are not all angels ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation? So you can see why this has got a bit messy over the centuries and why people have argued over it and stuff. Calvin, who was a 16th century theologian, pastor and reformer, said this: "The interpretation given to this passage by some commentators as if God assigned to each believer his own angel does not rest on solid grounds. For the words of Christ do not mean that a single angel is continually occupied with this or that person. And such an idea is inconsistent with the whole doctrine of Scripture, which declares that the angels encamp around the godly, and that not one angel only, but many, have been commissioned to guard every one of the faithful. Away then with the fanciful notion of a good and evil angel, and let us rest satisfied with holding that the care of the whole church is committed to angels to assist each member as his necessities should require." Yes, we do have angels looking after us, but not one particular angel to every person. We don't know how many angels they have, but when you think there's something like 8 billion people on the planet, that's an awful lot of angels. Absolutely. It's never happened to me, but I know people personally who are convinced they have. So in verse 10, it seems likely that Jesus is talking about followers of his, people being committed to his way of life, being childlike in attitude, as well as alluding to the fact that all believers are protected by angels. And by necessity, angels who protect and minister to believers must have face-to-face access to God. Now, if you look carefully here, you will notice that there's a verse missing. There is no verse 11. Yes, some versions have. The New International Version, there is no verse 11. The missing verse reads, "For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost." Yeah, that is not in all translations. A lot of them, the newer ones, like the New International Version, and think have not got that verse 11. It's important to remember that the New Testament was written in Greek and Aramaic, predominantly in Greek. And the verse missing from some of the Bibles because the passage does not actually appear in the best of the early Greek manuscripts which contain Matthew's Gospel. Now there are, so they say, and I haven't counted them, and I'm not going to dispute the figures, but they say there are around 5,500 manuscripts of the New Testament. And by using a process called textual criticism, scholars have been able to determine very accurately how the original manuscripts should read. And textual criticism has determined that verse 11 should not exist in Matthew chapter 18, since it does not appear in the oldest and best manuscripts. Many scholars believe that it was added by a copyist taken from Luke chapter 19 and verse 10. This is why we need to study the Bible. It's why we need several interpretations or translations. It's why you need a good interlinear Bible which gives you Greek, Hebrew, and English. Because translating from one language to another is an imprecise science, and there are words that simply cannot be translated. And so we have to not necessarily take what the English says at face value, but to look at the original Greek and see what the person who spoke was trying to convey. And a good example of that, one which probably everybody knows, is one of the commandments, which very often say, "Thou shalt not kill." And that is really not accurate, because the original translation reads more like, "Thou shalt not commit murder," which alters the whole context of the passage. And this is why we need to study the Word with several translations and a good interlinear Bible, because we need to get to the bottom of what Jesus is trying to say to us, the message he's trying to convey, which doesn't always come across accurately in the English translations. If it was easy, it wouldn't be worthwhile, would it? Okay, verses 12 to 14. What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go to look for the one that has wandered off? And if he finds it, I tell you the truth, he is happier about that one sheep than about all the 99 that did not wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost. So chapter 18 started with Jesus' disciples coming to him with the question, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And as we've not seen anything in the narrative to suggest otherwise, we can assume that now, in verse 12, he's still talking to the disciples. Now he is telling his disciples not to look down on little ones. He asks them what seems to be a rhetorical question. And I say rhetorical because although he asks them, what do you think? He doesn't seem to give them time to answer. He says, what do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one wanders away, will he not leave the 99 and go and look for the one that has wandered off? That's a comforting thought if you think about it. Every time you wander off, the shepherd goes looking for you. It's up to you whether you go back to the fold with him or whether you run away from him and stuff. You know, it's no wonder sometimes human beings are compared to sheep, because we can be incredibly stupid sometimes, just like sheep. Contending for the faith says this. This parable is so important that Jesus begins with this question. Jesus appeals to the people's sense of priority and wisdom. They know the typical shepherd will respond to a lost sheep as Jesus describes. And MacArthur notes that Jesus' statement is a common phrase used by teachers to get their students' attention so they might ponder carefully what is being taught them. The disciples would have been familiar with the concept of shepherds because it was part of life in those days around them. Shepherds were a common sight, and as Jesus explains that the shepherd would go after the one sheep that has wandered off and would rejoice when it was found, the disciples would have understood completely what Jesus is talking about. And he finishes his discourse by telling them that in the same way a shepherd protects his sheep, his Father in heaven is not willing that any of the little ones that he has been talking about should be lost. And Barnes says this, to show still further the reason why we should not despise Christians, he introduced a parable showing the joy felt when a thing lost is found. A shepherd rejoices over the recovery of one of his flock that has wandered more than over all that remained. So God rejoices that a man is restored. So he seeks his salvation and wills that not one thus found should perish. If God thus loves and preserves the redeemed, then surely man should not despise them. If you like, the parable suggests the earthly mission of Jesus, the Good Shepherd. He left the joys of heaven to wander amid the bleak scenes of earth to recover lost and sinful people. It also has an application to the church or the flock of God, in that the true place for every sheep is in the fold. There's no safety for the sheep that is separated from the shepherd and the fold. And the lost sheep represents a child of God who has become a backslider, if you like. We call them prodigals. They've become separated from the shepherd. They've wandered off from the fold. Thankfully, the shepherd doesn't leave them out there. Sometimes it's just a question of whether the sheep are paying attention or not. Because even the biggest backslider, if they pay attention, will hear Jesus calling to them again, gently calling them back into the fold again. But the question is, sometimes, like sheep are so busy grazing that they don't hear the shepherd or they don't listen to him. So sometimes these backsliders just don't simply hear God until they hit the bottom. And then eventually they suddenly start listening and realize that Jesus has been calling them all along. They just haven't noticed. It's comforting to know that the shepherd is always there protecting us and looking for us. Yes? No. Exactly. Exactly. Just like it. Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's God allowing it. People could say, why does God allow things like that? Yeah. But, yeah, look at it this way. Saul had a Damascus Road experience. Yeah. Any prodigal, God could just stand in front of him and say, whoa, you're going wrong. This is the way, come back. But that is not beneficial to people. It's better for people to find out of their own volition that they've gone wrong, because they're more likely to go back and do something about it. If I tell you that you're doing wrong, you're not going to listen to me. You'll think you're right. It's only when you come to the conclusion yourself that you're wrong that you realize, yeah, right, I'm wrong. I better go and do something about it. And you have to go to a certain place to get to that realization. Kaufman tells us some facts about sheep. A lost sheep is absolutely defenseless. It has no weapon of any kind, no gift of speed in flight, no cunning, no means of deception. Its very cries being only a signal for the enemy to close in for the kill. Let every backslider behold here his helplessness apart from Christ. Secondly, the sheep has no sense of direction. A carrier pigeon would surely be able to return to its nest. A dog might find its way home, but a sheep, never. And thirdly, a lost sheep is surrounded by enemies. Even the elemental forces of nature being hostile and often fatal to him when he's separated from God, from the fold. Shepherding in ancient times was a dangerous occupation for the sheep and the shepherd. The steep, rugged Judean mountains are filled with ravines and gullies and caves and crevices into which sheep might wander or fall. While protecting his flock, the shepherd might come face to face with a wild animal. The Bible tells us a story, doesn't it, of David fighting a lion and a bear as a young shepherd boy. Contending for the faith says this: so deep is the shepherd's love that he risks his own life on the dark and dangerous mountains. In a like manner, Jesus' love is so deep that he too risks it all on Mount Calvary. The love of God is a seeking love. The shepherd was not content to wait for the sheep to come back. He went out to search for it. That is what the Jew could not understand about the Christian idea of God. The Jew would gladly agree that if the sinner came crawling wretchedly home, God would forgive. But we know that God is far more wonderful than that. For in Jesus Christ, he came to seek those who wander away. God is not content to wait until men come home. He goes out to search for them no matter what it costs him. Amen. And I'm going to call it a day there.